Hello everyone, taking today's edition of the Daf Yomi. Today's Daf is Bava kamma, Daf 73 Amud B. I'll go from the last paragraph. The sages say, in rejection of this opinion, if it were accepted that the legal state of a pause or retraction within the time required for speaking a short phrase is like that of common speech, everyone would agree that the witness is disqualified retroactively, and their testimony with regard to the theft would also be negated. But here they disagree about that very issue, i.e. whether the legal state of a pause or retraction within the time required for speaking a short phrase is like that of continuous speech. The rabbis maintain that if the pause is within the time required for speaking a short phrase, then the two aspects of the testimony provided by the witnesses are not like one testimony of continuous speech, but are considered separate testimonies, and therefore the testimony concerning the theft remains valid. Now, the Yoshi maintains that the legal state of a pause within the time required for speaking a short phrase is like that of continuous speech, and therefore the testimony about the theft is disqualified together with the testimony concerning the slaughter. And the Gemara asks, but does Rabbi Yossi really maintain that the legal state of a statement interrupted or retracted within the time required for speaking a short phrase is like that of continuous speech? We're doing it in other words in the mission to Ruma 25b. If one designates an animal by saying this animal is hereby a substitute to Mura, the possibility of substitution is mentioned in the Torah in Leviticus 27:10, and the tractate Teruma focuses on this halachot. The main features of this concept are as follows. The Torah renders it prohibited to substitute any animal, whether whole or blemished, for an animal designated as an offering. One who does so violates the prohibition and is liable to receive the punishment of lashes. Nevertheless, despite the fact that substituting an animal for an offering is prohibited, if an act of substitution is performed, the second animal does not acquire a measure of sanctity, while the animal initially designated as an offering also remains sacred. All animals can be used as substitutes, whether they are whole or blemished, and the animal designated as a substitute can never be worked or redeemed. The fate of a substitute varies with the particular type of offering. In some instances, such as a substitute for a sin offering, the animal is left to die. And in the cases such as that of a guilt offering, the animal is put out to graze until it becomes blemished. Lastly, some substitutes, e.g. that of a peace offering, are consecrated in addition to the original offering. For a burnt offering, a substitute for a peace offering. In a case where one says this animal is hereby a substitute for a burnt offering and a substitute for a peace offering, if his intention from the outset was that the animal is to be a substitute for both types of offering, his statement stands. The halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi as his rulings are followed in a dispute to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Sefer Kabbalah and Hilchot Teruma 2:4. He has issued two contradictory statements, and therefore this animal is considered a substitute for a burnt offering, i.e. only the first part of the statement is accepted. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi says, if he intended this outcome from the outset, that the animal should serve both as a substitute of a burnt offering and a substitute of a peace offering, since it is impossible for one to call it by two names at once, the only way he could make his intent known is by issuing these two apparently contradictory declarations consecutively. His statement stands. So let's explain that. The Ram Kayom, the statement stands, this animal is treated in the following manner. It is put out to pasture until it develops a blemish, at which point it may be sold. Half of the proceeds from the sale are used to procure a burnt offering, while the other half goes toward the purchase of a peace offering, says Rashi. And the animal has a state of both a substitute for a burnt offering and a substitute for a peace offering. But if he said this animal is a substitute for a burnt offering and then changed his mind and said a substitute for a peace offering, it's a substitute for a burnt offering. And we discussed this ruling. If he changed his mind before saying a substitute for a peace offering, it's obvious that he cannot remove the stages or he has already applied to the animal. And the animal certainly made a substitute for a burnt offering. Rabbi Yossi would not have issued such an obvious ruling. And Rav Papa said in response to this question, we are speaking of a case when the individual changed his mind within the time required for speaking a short phrase. Some claim that the statement quoted in the Gemara, peace be upon you, my rabbi and teacher, is exact. i.e. the maximum amount of pause is the time required for the recitation of these three Hebrew words. Others maintain that the maximum pause is actually the amount of time required just to say these three Hebrew words, peace be upon you, my rabbi. So many commentaries cite the following reason for this particular choice of time management. When one is engaged in an activity or speaking and his rabbi or student suddenly passes by, it is considered appropriate for him to stop what he is doing to deliver these words of greeting. Since this is not considered an interruption, it may be inferred that any pause of comparable length is likewise not an interruption. That's from Rabbeinu Tam Sefer Hayashar. Others maintain that these words are merely a random example of a short period of time, during which it is acceptable for an average person to retract or alter what he just said. The Ran on the Durham 87a. And the other one is the time required for the rabbi to greet a student. When does Rabbi Yossi hold that a statement added within the time required for speaking a short phrase is not considered continuous speech? When the words are added within the time required for a student to greet his rabbi using the phrase, "Peace be upon you, my rabbi and teacher," this is a long pause. By contrast, if the statement is added within the shorter time frame required for the rabbi to greet the student, "Peace be upon you," Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that the added words constitute speech that is continuous with the original statement. Rabbi says witnesses to a capital crime who were first contradicted by two other witnesses, and ultimately the first set of witnesses were when the conspiring witnesses are killed. Witnesses who were first contradicted by other witnesses and subsequently rendered conspiring witnesses are subject to the punishment of conspiring witnesses, as the contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony. According to the opinion of Bava, Rambam Sefer Shoftim Hilchot Eidos 18:4 Torah Yuchan Orach 38 are killed in accordance with the punishment for conspiring witnesses involved in the capital case, despite the fact that their testimony was already disqualified prior to the discovery of their conspiracy. The reason is that the contradiction of testimony is at the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony. Only the process has not yet been completed at the time of contradiction. Rava said, "From where do I say that this is so? As it is taught in a Braisa into the Sefta Makos 1:3, that if witnesses say, we testify with regard to so-and-so that he blinded his Canaanite slave's eye and after knocked out his tooth, the Torah states that a Canaanite slave remains the permanent property of his owner and may not release him, Leviticus 25:46. Nevertheless, if the owner had caused certain types of injury to his slave, e.g. blinding him in one eye and knocking out a tooth, the slave is automatically emancipated. There are 24 limbs whose loss causes a slave to be emancipated. These are enumerated in Tractate Negayim 6:7 and Kedushim 25a, and therefore the master is obligated to pay him compensation for the value of his tooth, as this is what the master says. Shaharei harav omer kain. If a master both blinds an eye and knocks out a tooth of his Canaanite slave, the slave gains his freedom as a result of the first injury, Exodus 21:26-27. Subsequently, as a free man, he receives monetary compensation for the second injury. The value of an eye is substantially greater than that of a tooth. Therefore, the master would prefer the testimony of the witnesses who say that he caused damage to his eye first, rather than those who claim the reverse, and this testimony is advantageous to the master. And subsequently they were found to be conspiring witnesses. They pay the value of an eye to the slave. Rava says that the Braisa is, as written, is problematic. What are the circumstances of this case? If we say that it is exactly as it is taught in the Braisa, that there is no other set of witnesses other than those whose statement is quoted in the Braisa, and the opponent set of witnesses to establish them as conspiring witnesses, several problems arise. First, why should they pay the value of an eye to the slave? After emancipating him by testifying that his master has blinded him, should they be required to pay him the value of his eye? And furthermore, they should be required to pay the value of the entire slave to the master, as he intends to cause him to lose ownership of his slave through false testimony. And furthermore, why does the Bible say, as that is what the master says? I.e., this testimony is advantageous to the master. Is it really satisfactory to the master that his slave be emancipated as a result of this testimony? Well, there must be that this case involves another competing testimony that is not mentioned in the Braita. It's not correct to say that the Braita is dealing with a case where, prior to the testimonies mentioned in the Braita, two other witnesses came and said, the master first knocked out the slave's tooth and then blinded his eye, in which case the master is required to emancipate the slave and also to give him the value of his eye. And then an intermediate set of two witnesses came and said that the testimony quoted in the Braita, that first the master blinded the slave's eye and then knocked out his tooth. According to this account, the master would still be required to emancipate the slave, but would be required to give him only the value of his tooth. which is much less than the value of an eye. In this case, the testimony of the first set of witnesses contradicts the testimony of the intermediate ones. And this is the meaning of the clause. And that is what the master says, i.e., this testimony is advantageous to the master. It means that what the immediate witnesses say, i.e., that he owes the value of a tooth, is satisfactory to him, as according to the claim of the first set, he owes the value of an eye. Since they are now contradictory testimonies, the testimony stating the claim of a loss of lesser value is accepted. And in that case, the master would have to pay the slave only for the value of his tooth, in addition to emancipating him. This judgment corresponds exactly to the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses. And the Bava subsequently teaches, and then the intermediate set of witnesses were found to be conspiring witnesses, as the third set of witnesses testified that the intermediate set was not at the scene of this incident at all. Therefore, the intermediate set of witnesses pays the value of an eye to the slave, less the value of a tooth. And this is the amount of monetary damage the slave stood to incur as a result of their testimony. Bava concludes his proof. Knowing the Bava that the contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony, although the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses had already been contradicted before it was shown to be conspiring testimony, nevertheless they can still be established as conspiring witnesses at that latter stage, which means that they must pay an amount equivalent to the loss they were attempting to cause through their testimony. Abai said no. There is another possible interpretation for the Bava which answers the questions raised above and yet does not serve as proof of others' opinion. According to his interpretation, the contradictory testimony was given after, not before, the testimony mentioned in the Bava. It is possible that the Bava is discussing a case where a second set of witnesses both reverse the order of events by testifying that the tooth was knocked out before the blinding of the eye, and at the same time render the first set of witnesses as comparing witnesses by testifying that those original witnesses were not at the scene of supposed events they claim to have witnessed. It can be argued, albeit in a far-fetched manner, that the testimony of the first set of witnesses is considered to be the master's advantage even at this stage, because he knows what really happened, as reflected in the testimony of the latter witnesses. Accordingly, Bava maintains that there is a total of 3 sets of witnesses in the case of the Bava, while Abai says there are only 2 sets. Abai elaborates, from where do I say my interpretation of the Bava is correct? That's the end of the Omid. Thank you for listening, and all the best. Bye.